Welcome everyone. If you're just joining our webinar, we're gonna wait just a minute or two until everyone's able to join and then we'll get started. Hi everyone, and welcome to the 5th lecture in our fall series of talks about migrations. I'm Eleanor Painter, a postdoctoral associate with Cornell's Advocacy Center and the Migrations Initiative. And we're so glad to have you with us as we explore migrations in global, multi-species, interdisciplinary terms. If you've been following our talks, then you know that this series is part of Cornell's Global Grand Challenge in Migrations. And with this Global Grand Challenge, we're bringing together scholars from across the university who are pursuing work to address key issues related to borders, rights, and the interconnected movements of plants, people, animals, goods, ideas, and as you'll see in today's talk in just a few moments. This series also forms the backbone of a new course I have the pleasure of teaching together with Wendy Wolford, and it's wonderful to reflect on these lectures together with this group of students who are also here with us today. Today's topic, Conceptualizing Farmworker Rights in Asia, will be especially resonant for those of you who were here with us last week when we heard from Mary Jo Dudley speaking about the Cornell Farmworker program, which works here in New York. And today, we're really looking forward to hearing from Beth, Lyon, and Pranoto Iskandar about their work on issues facing farm workers in Asia. To introduce them and to moderate today's discussion, we have Steve Yellair, professor at the law school here, and Steve is also a migrations faculty fellow with the Advocacy Center. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Glad to be here. And now I'm delighted to introduce the two panelists for today's webinar. First is Beth Lyon, who is clinical professor and founder of the Farmworker Legal Assistance Clinic at Cornell Law School and one of my colleagues. She's also associate dean for experiential learning at the law school. So she's a very busy person. I'm glad that she was able to make time for us today. Presenting with her is Pranoto Iskandar. He is founding director of the Institute for Migrant Rights. He's a doctoral research fellow at the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism in Montreal. And Beth and I both had the pleasure of working with Pranoto when he was here at Cornell Law School as an LLM a year or so ago. So today they're going to talk about conceptualizing migrant farm worker rights in Asia, and I'll turn it right over to them. Beth, Pranoto, go ahead. Oh, one last thing before I forget. We will be accepting questions. So if you do have questions, use the Q&A feature in Zoom to post your question. And if you see other questions in the Q&A and think that that's a particularly good question, you can also highlight it to make it rise to the top. And be sure to write your questions as we go along. So we'll have a number of questions to ask Beth and Pranoto when they get done with their formal presentation. And now I really will turn it over to Beth and Pranoto.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you, Eleanor, and really the whole Global Migrations team for the support for today's presentation, the invitation, and just this wonderful series and programming that you've been developing this year. It's been very exciting. So Pranoto and I are both very happy to be here with you today and to represent the larger comparative migrant farm worker rights team. A couple of members of that team I know are with us today in the session and might be able to speak during the Q&A, Justin Lin and Tom Chapman, who are also working on the project. So to get us started, I'm going to show some slides, so that will take me a moment to get that going. Okay, just making sure. Can someone unmute and tell me if you're seeing what I'm seeing? The first slide.
Yes, it's working correctly.
Thank you, great. Okay, wonderful. So here to start us off are the topics that we're going to cover. First, a little bit of background on the project, why we think the theme is important, and sort of institutionally how we developed the team that we have. And then we have a number of ongoing projects, and we've selected two to give you sort of a general overview, to give you a sense of what we're up to. And I want to acknowledge now that we have a lot of detail on some of the slides that we might not get to. And so if we don't cover everything or we don't reach all the slides, feel free to reach out to me. I can send you a copy of the slides or give you more information about anything that we discussed today. Happy to think of this as a continuing conversation. So starting off with a little bit of background about the project, the first question I thought we should answer is why we think migrant farm worker rights need to be conceptualized. So I might say the word farm worker, and probably each of us will have a vivid image that pops into mind. If you're from the United States, you might imagine a Mexican national wearing a bandana working in a strawberry field in California. If you're from Europe, you might picture a Gambian national who's working in an olive grove in Italy, or a Romanian national who's picking asparagus in Germany. Or if you've lived or worked on a farm yourself, you may be thinking about your own family or your friends or your personal history. So everyone, I think, kind of has a sense of what farm workers do, and even has a kind of a visual picture. But beyond that, there's usually not a lot of information sort of in the public consciousness about farm workers. And the first data point we wanted to share with you is that farm workers are quite numerically significant. According to the United Nations, roughly 12% of all the workers on the planet, or about 120 million people, are farm workers. And when we say farm workers, we mean waged agricultural workers. So if you take that number and you add in farmers, about 1 billion people in total are employed in agriculture around the world, representing 1 in 3 of all workers. Another reason we think it's important to think about farm workers and to discuss their rights is because, as Mary Jo Dudley described so well in her talk last week, farm workers tend to come from subordinated and vulnerable communities, including migrants and racial minorities, oftentimes indigenous people. And 70% of the world's child labor takes place on farms. Looking at the United States briefly, which has a history, as we know, of chattel slavery to subsidize export agriculture, the government today acknowledges that a majority of crop workers are undocumented, and other studies and anecdotal accounts indicate that probably the vast majority of all farm workers in this country are undocumented. So we have numerosity and we have vulnerability. But because of their lack of political power, farm workers have not been able to wrangle protection from the government in the way that they should. And so therefore, farm worker rights are typically one of the least developed areas of labor regulation. Now, this difference between farmers and farm workers is an important threshold distinction for us. It may seem pretty obvious, but if you look at farm labor through a human rights lens of vulnerability, there can be some confusion, because a farm worker is someone who does not own the land that they work. They don't own the factor of production. They don't acquire profit. They only acquire wages. But there's also a category of farmers called peasants or smallholders who are also in need of protection, even though they might own the land or have some claim to the land where they work. So in 2018, when the United Nations issued a declaration on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas, as they were negotiating the treaty, at first the focus was actually entirely on the vulnerabilities of peasants and smallholders. And it was only later on in the process of drafting, you can see here in the definition that I put up, it's only sort of tacked on at the end, was the focus added in on landless waged workers. And that was only at the urging of an international food workers union. So making those distinctions sometimes can be difficult. And in this image, I have another example that shows you how farm workers can just be obscured from view politically by their employers. And so this story has been out there a little bit, I think, on the internet, so you may have heard it already, but I think it bears repeating in this context. So in 2018, as Hurricane Florence was approaching North Carolina, a mandatory evacuation was ordered, but on one particular farm, the farm workers were ordered to stay at the labor camp that you see in this image. On the morning of the 4th day after the order, the workers called 911 to report that their housing was flooded and to request a rescue. And the county immediately dispatched what's called a swift water rescue team. But the farm owner then called in and told the county not to send anyone out, whereupon the county simply called off the rescue. But the water kept getting higher. Mattresses were floating out. You know, it was becoming a very dangerous situation. So the workers kept calling. They called their legal services lawyers. They called their farm labor contractors. And eventually, much later in the day, the farm labor contractors managed to get them out. And so I'm telling you this story because I want to read you a quote from the county official who was asked why an emergency rescue would be called off on the word of the property owner despite firsthand phone calls and requests from the stranded workers who were in danger. And here's what the official said. He, the farmer, is the actual owner and representative of the property. And in that situation, we're going to use the information from the most reliable source. And so that statement from a municipal official in North Carolina really, for me, captures in a microcosm why we're still talking about conceptualizing farm worker rights, because when it comes to farm workers, government has essentially failed to do its baseline job of protecting vulnerable people. So those are a couple of our sort of first assumptions in working on the project. And now I'm going to share a little bit about kind of how institutionally this group came together and began working on the project. So the Farm Worker Legal Assistance Clinic is a course that I teach over here at the law school in Hughes Hall. And it's one of about 20 clinical courses that we have. And in the clinic, Brianna Beltran, my co-teacher, and I work with students to provide free legal services to farm workers. First, to redress violations of their workplace rights, and second, to provide deportation defense. And our work involves a myriad of legal issues coming from problems like extreme overwork, sexual harassment, wrongful discharge in the workplace. And our deportation defense practice currently has a particular focus on child and youth farm workers who are in active removal proceedings. And this picture shows you sort of the area that we're working in. The little image that you see over in Buffalo is the Buffalo Immigration Court. And that red line shows you the jurisdiction of the Buffalo Immigration Court. It has a very, very large jurisdiction. There are a lot of farm workers that are caught up in removal proceedings throughout that whole area. And it's very difficult for them to find lawyers who are willing to represent them in the Buffalo Immigration Court, let alone all the different fora where they have to appear in order to try to secure immigration status. And so one of the areas of focus for the clinic has been trying to extend our work by accepting cases in counties where you can't find good legal support, what we call access to justice deserts. And so oftentimes we'll either try to take a case that no one else will accept, or we'll try to recruit, train, and support volunteer lawyers to handle the cases that we don't have the resources to take on ourselves. Another key focus for the clinic is providing policy advocacy research and report drafting support to our community partners. And here I've included the image of a report recently produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center with help from our clinic, focusing on the issue of prison labor in the poultry industry. So in the clinic, we work with a variety of partners. I've just put a list here to give you a sense of some of the wonderful groups on campus and off campus that we've had a chance to work with. And really, in the 5 years since we opened the clinic, we've had a sort of a primary focus on farm workers whose country of employment is the United States. Whether it's someone who's still in the United States or they've returned to their home country, really we've been very kind of US centric. But about 3 years ago, Pranoto came to Cornell to study with us. And he and a group of other lawyers joined the Farmworker Clinic, and they had sort of an interest in our direct casework, but also they wanted to take a look at the situation of farm workers in their own countries. And so through Pranoto's leadership, we very quickly connected with multiple NGOs and scholars in various jurisdictions in Asia, and began producing reports and memoranda about farm worker situation and farm worker law in several different countries. And so that work led us to really getting involved in some advocacy, direct advocacy around farm worker rights in different places. And the pictures that you see here are pictures of Wallace Wong, who was an alum who studied alongside Pranoto, a Taiwanese lawyer, and with support from both Engage Cornell and the law school's Berger Fellowship in International and Comparative Law. Wallace began working with the Yilong Fishing Workers Union while he was here at Cornell, and after he returned home, continues to serve as their pro bono general counsel, direct legal services provider. You see him doing Know Your Rights outreach there in one of the images. And we in the clinic have stayed involved with his work supporting various op-eds that you can see pictured here, and also an intervention that he submitted to the UN, I think about a year ago. And so along with advocacy support, we also began to develop a research agenda. So the image that you see on the left is the cover page of a paper by MPS student Leah Kraut, who enrolled in the clinic and produced as her sort of MPS, I guess, capstone project paper, the first study I've seen really of kind of how international law directly touches the situation of farm workers. So very much focused on international law. So that's been a kind of a helpful baseline paper for us. And Pranoto has led 2 groups of researchers to conduct pilot surveys of tea pickers in Indonesia, interviews with tea industry leaders and other experts, and Justin Lin conducted fieldwork in Taiwan. And I'm very excited that Justin has just secured a fellowship to join this project full-time starting next month. And we're also very grateful that this portion of the project, mainly focusing on the situation of Indonesian workers in Taiwan, is being partially funded by the Global Grand Challenge. And what you see here is sort of a list of some of the research priorities that we've developed as a group working over the past year or so. And a few of these research strands we've had to put on hold because of COVID, unfortunately. So Pranoto and I decided to present to you the first and the last topics that you see. And so what I will do now is hand it over to Pranoto to discuss the topic of Indonesia as a farm worker nation.
Thanks, Beth. So in addition to what has been described so far by Beth, my part is more like the speculative side of this farm worker project. So one of the interesting phenomenon related with farm workers that from history, we know that many Asian political leaders, especially the revolutionary like Mao or Pol Pot and Sukarno, they appropriate farm worker as their rallying point. The slide. So how to work with this? So for that reason, so for this because of this phenomenon, so we think that it would be interesting to understand why farm worker become become the rallying point in Asian political debate or in the political discourse. But the more we think about it, the more we realize that I think the most developed is in the context of Indonesia, where Sukarno has present his speech about why the Marxist concept of proletarian doesn't fit for Indonesia. So the interesting part about Sukarno is that Sukarno is a political figure in Indonesia who produced a lot of like a political concept or thinking that doesn't really have the detail. So I think from this project we can find. I think we will we can contribute to the current debate about the relevance of democracy in many countries, because I think this Indonesian case can help us to see how political discourse use this Farmworker as some sort of populism. Can you move it to the next? And also about what maybe it's also we can also help to help the debate on the project of state building in the post-colonial context, because Indonesia is currently still in the process of state building. So one of the I mean probably the most interesting challenge about Indonesia, as I said earlier, is that Sukarno is not a political theorist, and I'm not really sure that he's interested in political theories. But Sukarno is very interesting. It's very interesting because he has lots of concept that has no detail. So I think, but should we? So the question is, should we take him seriously? So the answer is probably yes, although it's not. So to answer that questions, why a half-baked concept needs to be taken seriously is we need to go to the Indonesian society itself, especially the Java. So if we the Japanese, so if we allow to like if we to quote the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who said that if ever there was a tail which wagged the dog, Java is the tail, Indonesia is the dog. So we need to understand the Japanese culture, and to understand the Japanese culture is why I think we should. The Japanese is very has a culture called cultural ambiguity. Can you move it? So this is why I think. This is why Sukarno is a revolutionary without program, but behind it, there's an interesting story. Next page. So as a rural society, the Japanese relied at the heart of their social relationship is sawa. Sawa is where people produce rice. The sawa require a very difficult maintenance because it require constant water at a certain quality. So most of the population, because they relied on water, so they have to maintain some kind of a harmonious relationship among them. Otherwise, they will fail the harvest. And for that reason, so the communications in Japanese society tend to be very vague, so they don't go to the detail because, you know, it might hurt someone else feeling. So because of this, I think this concept of being ambiguous is also being imported by Sukarno and elevated it at the national level, at the national political discourse. That's why Sukarno doesn't really need, is not interested in detailing what he meant by having a state that worked for the Farmworker. So, next page. And this is the process of people work at Sawah. And then next bit. So this is the syncretism. So that's why this ambiguity, because you have to maintain the harmonious relationship. So so the Japanese tend to adopt a model where, you know, all of their belief is based on syncretism. So the Japanese, so for example, in this temple, many things that this temple wouldn't exist other than in Indonesia. So this is the temple of the Buddhist temple. But inside of it, if you look at it, there is a statue of Shiva, the god of Hindu, but Shiva posed in a Buddha, like a Buddha. So this is how the Japanese society operates. So they mix things up, and I think this is reflected in the politics of Indonesia also. Next. And so that's why Indonesia tends to be very ambiguous in terms of their communications and also the way they present their idea. And next bit. And then so the hunch is why we need to take this seriously, because I think Sukarno is perceptive about what their about what the situation in Indonesia that he thinks needs to be highlighted. Because certainly by making a good connections with their audience, that is the Indonesians or the Japanese to be particular, it can help to maintain his positions at the political debate. So based on this hunch, so we thought that Farmworker become the recurring term in Indonesian political discourse, especially among the nationalists, since the pre-independence to today's debate, is that because Sukarno is trying to exploit the Indonesians' sentiments or empathy toward the underprivileged in the society. So based on our preliminary research, is that in Indonesia, the for example, in the pre-colonial era, in the object is always the worker. So that's why this concept of the pre-colonial state of Indonesia is not based on the territory. So the most important thing is the people, the labor. So Indonesian has no concept of territorial state, and so the ruling populations or the nobility, they fight for the people. to be their laborer, and certainly to work in the field. And then next. And then when the Dutch arrived as a trader, the Dutch capitalized the existing slavery system in Indonesia. So the Dutch, and it seems that the Dutch interested in slavery to be engaging in the transnational slavery, because they need the Indonesian, because they know how to work with, or to how to work in the field to produce rice, to cultivate rice. So, and then in the next slide, when the Dutch turned themselves into a full-blown colonizer, the Dutch introduced a system called cultivation system, where the Indonesians work at the plantations. And according to many historical account, the Indonesian work as a laborer receive a very, very difficult, very bad treatment during this time. And some people think, because I remember like my grandparent talk about this, his memory when he was a kid, he thinks that this is one of the worst period in his life. And then next, Beth. And this is when the Japanese came to occupy in Indonesia. Although the Japanese only stayed for 3.5 years, but then again, this is one of the very, very very difficult period in Indonesian history, because many Indonesian work or transported by Japan to even go as far to like a Burma to work at the field. And also in this period, the nationalists tried to hide the involvement of Sukarno in helping the Japanese to proceed with this agenda. And then the next, and in this next slide, we also see the continuations of the plight of Farmworker in the context of Indonesia. So Indonesia is currently now as probably one of the world largest labor sending country to work in the agricultural industry. And so slavery in fishing industry, for example, in Taiwan, the Guardian note that this is one of the worst, and many of the workers are from Indonesia. So I guess that's why the idea of, or the political imaginations of Farmworker in Indonesian political discourse is persistent. So the question, so the next questions I think that I need to answer is, how are we going to do how are we going to do the research for this subject? So one of the one of our plan is to have an interview with all these nationalist politicians who talk about and then we're trying to connect it with the historical account to make sense why this ideas is so occupy the central place in the political discourse, but at the same time the Farmworker doesn't really do not make it into the priority, the political agenda. So I guess that's from me.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Pranoto. Okay, and give me a thumbs up. You can still hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you. So, you know, one of the reasons we were really taken with the thinking about how farm workers were kind of deployed as a political symbol early on, but, you know, still are in, you know, a very dire situation and a disadvantaged situation, really, you know, has led us to be thinking about migration as, you know, invasion, or migration as colonization, and kind of that side of migration as well. So it's been, the migration themes have been sparking a lot of interesting conversations for us. I'm just going to wrap up with a short presentation on another project that we are embarked upon, which is sort of deriving international farm worker law, and thinking about whether farm worker law is really something that migrates. Is it something that can be sort of framed as international? And really, does the US experience with farm worker law provide any utility in other settings, and in particular in the countries where we're working on this project? So the first thing we wanted to think about, and really that research we did in the first year helped us to come to the conclusion that a lot of the issues that farm workers face, and that Mary Jo explained so clearly last week, really are pretty ubiquitous, at least in the jurisdictions in Asia that we studied. And some of them are quite unique as compared with other workers or other vulnerable populations. And one is just this curious sort of circumstance of exclusion from basic protections. Whatever baseline protections you might find in a particular legal regime or society, you will often find that farm workers have been excluded from those protections, that actually lesser protections are written into the law. In the US, it's a pretty simple explanation. As Mary Jo said, we had a history of chattel slavery. At the time that the New Deal was written, 80% of farm workers and domestic workers were African American. And so the Southern lobby essentially took a bite out of the New Deal and prevented those two job categories from having access to most of the protections of that, of those range of labor protections that the US promulgated. So it was sort of the New Deal taking place at the time of Jim Crow. And so that's kind of the explanation historically in the US why today farm workers are still excluded from any number of basic labor protections. And then there's another overlapping set of exclusions for people who are undocumented workers, who are also kept out of certain protective regimes. So I guess when I first started doing comparative research, I didn't expect to find that particular history in other places. So I studied the law in Norway. I went and interviewed some advocates and policymakers in Norway and learned that they had had the same exclusion for sort of different reasons, but their exclusions of farm workers from protection were not corrected really until the 2000s. And the US is still working very slowly to correct and fill those gaps in the law. So exclusions are a common theme. The existence of a kind of a labor chain, of an intervener. I mentioned the farm labor contractor who rescued those workers from their flooded housing. So the farm labor contractor in some parts of Europe, they're called a gangmaster, are sort of handling a lot of the functions of an employer, but they're often not liable to the workers themselves legally. And so closing that liability gap is something that took a long time in the United States. Didn't happen until the early 1980s. Wage theft is very common. Piece rate is used on farms, so people are paid by how much they produce instead of being paid strictly by the hour. And it's very easy to kind of game that system and to pay people below what they have to earn in terms of the minimum wage. The fact that people live in housing that's controlled by their employers means that there are all kinds of special legal issues that come up. It's much easier to prevent people from leaving their housing. It's easy to stop people from having the right to admit visitors, for example, their lawyers. Over the years, I've had students experience all kinds of problems attempting to provide simple legal services to their clients because farmers don't want them to come onto the property. And also we're seeing today coercive quarantining regimes. So Pranoto mentioned fishing workers, Indonesian fishing workers in Taiwan. Well, they're being quarantined on their ships, which is also where they live and where they work, even when they come into port. And so some of the legal battles that RLM has been working on have been around the treatment of people who are being held on their ships. Sexual violence, some of the pictures you saw of farms, you can see how they're very remote. It's very easy for predators to harass women. There's a very high percentage of rape that occurs in farm labor as opposed to other industries. So sexual violence is something we've heard about in other country settings. The special issues around seasonality, around work that only that takes place at certain peak periods and not at other times, and what that means for employment status raises particular issue. The use of pesticides, and then as I mentioned, such a high percentage of child labor is taking place on farms. So there's sort of common issues that play out in various settings. And so another thing that we learned as we really started to think about it, I've been practicing farm worker law for 25 plus years. And so I'd kind of forgotten that maybe that's not an area of law that most people think about. So I went out to kind of see what other people think of farm worker law. And I took a simple test, which was to go onto Amazon, and I searched for trade law, and numerous books and articles popped up. Trade law is an area of law that everyone knows about and lots of people write and think about. So if you search farm worker law, there are no books at all. A history of Cesar Chavez pops up on Amazon. So it's just not an area of law that is really sort of visible or imagined in most countries and even in the US. Similarly, the dictionary defines different branches of the law, but contains no definition for farm worker law. So here's the definition that if the dictionary contained one, it would probably show for farm worker law, which is the idea that it relates to people who work as hired employees in agriculture, and giving some examples of the different areas of law in which farm worker legal concerns can sound. So what I provided here is a list of the different domains in law where I and other farm worker lawyers around the country have practiced. Really, I would say in sort of the last 40, 50 years, there has been significant funding available for farm worker legal services, and these areas of law have been more developed. So why is there no dictionary definition of farm worker law or casebook? And why, as we'll describe more in a minute, is there not very much international farm worker law? And there are several reasons, even though, as we discussed, there are 120 million people who are in this category. The numbers really do justify the attention of the law. But first of all, we have the political power of the agricultural industry, which has really kept sort of the attention of government to this labor force at bay. And that's really slowed down the development of law. And the sort of classic deep subordination of the communities that are sending workers onto farms means that they have very little political power. If most of the workforce is undocumented, they don't have a vote, they don't have access to the channels of political power to make a change in the law that affects them. And so what that means is that there's relatively little discussion that's under theorized area of law. And it's not helped that it's in a rural area. And so there's a lack of civil society. There's a lack of lawyers and professionals who are really invested and interested in this area of law. So for example, Cornell Law School has only the country's second clinic to focus on farm worker law. Most law schools are sitting in urban areas focused on issues that are relevant to vulnerability in cities. And I would say that's true of most kind of public interest lawyers as well. And so as a result, we've seen very slow norm development, and looking at the international realm, those norms that actually have been promulgated have received very little attention. Countries are not willing to sign onto them or ratify them. And the norms that are out there often go unenforced. So for example, in the EU, there's a special directive from the year 2014. So again, fairly recent, that governs the conditions of entry and stay of third country nationals for the purposes of employment as seasonal workers. So kind of temporary guest workers working on farms for the most part. And in a recent report from last year, the EU discussed this directive and acknowledged that really the EU countries are not enforcing the directive. And now there's a lot more attention to it because under COVID, farm workers are being seen as essential. And so Europe, like America, is seeing that all these years of sort of neglect of regulation, neglect of protection, and allowing kind of groups of people to be working under the radar is really costing us, and it's really having a toll, a very big human toll, obviously, on the workers in COVID, and also on an economy that wasn't ready to bolster up an industry that really we all needed to keep going. So here's an example of the problem at the international level. What I'm showing you here at the top of the slide is the cluster of 8 what are called fundamental International Labor Organization conventions. The ILO is a branch or a part of the UN that focuses on worker protection. And so the ILO has designated 8 treaties around 4 topics as sort of fundamental conventions. So protecting people from forced labor, ensuring that people have the right to freedom of association, to form unions, the right to non-discrimination in the workplace, what we would call employment discrimination in the US, and protection for children to ensure that they're not involved in the worst forms of child labor. So what you're seeing is the ratification levels, the number of countries that have actually ratified these 8 fundamental treaties, and they're very high. So the ILO also has 2 treaties that protect migrant workers. The one on the left relates to documented migrant workers only. The one on the right additionally protects undocumented workers, making it more controversial. So as you can see, countries are not ratifying treaties when they relate to migrant workers. And then all the way on the right, you see the convention related to occupational safety and health in agriculture. And again, another politically sensitive topic, a very powerful industry of agriculture. Countries are not touching that convention. Down below, we see the set of what are called core United Nations human rights treaties. You've probably all heard of many of these treaties. And most of them have very high ratification levels, focusing on various different issues. The treaty on forced disappearance has a relatively low ratification level because it's a newer treaty and it's still working its way through the ratification process. But the Migrant Worker Convention has been around since 1990, but no country of employment, what we call a country that receives immigrant workers, for example, the United States, is willing to ratify it. And so there may be some protections there, but if no one ratifies them, they're not going to be monitored, they're not going to be enforced. Just going to take a look at our time. And so with Leah Kraut's work and with ongoing work by some of the students in the clinic this semester, we are trying to discover what standards there are that are most helpful for farm workers, and also sort of classify them because international law sounds like a simple concept, but for those of you who are not lawyers, it may sound as though it's one body of law, but actually it's quite an amalgam of law at the international level, in regional bodies like the Inter-American Human Rights System. Some of it is binding law, like a treaty that countries ratify, and much of it is what's called soft law. So that might be a treaty declaration or a statement of purpose, like the Declaration on Protecting Peasants is a statement, but it hasn't been ratified. It's not considered binding. And so what I've shown you here is a list of protections that do exist. They are written down in some international or transnational document, but it may have more or less force depending on where it's been written. So in green, I've placed the standards that I think are the most sort of securely established in international law. One of them is non-discrimination and equality of treatment. And that's very important because if a farm worker has been excluded from a basic labor protection, for example, in the US in federal law, farm workers have no right to overtime. They work extremely long hours. They have no right to overtime. And so the case that would sound in international law is that it's discrimination to exclude them from overtime simply because they're farm workers. or it's discrimination to exclude someone from the right to sue around employment discrimination because they're undocumented. So it's trying to level the playing field. And the right to collective action and to form unions, thanks to the ILR school and to the Angela Cornell and the labor law clinic here at the law school. It's great to see that that actually is a norm that is very well established, including for farm workers. There are also many special protections for workers based on certain vulnerabilities, such as children and elders. But as we move down this list of protections that I've placed here, they become sort of less and less secure, less and less well established in international law. And so just in the interest of time, I won't run through all of them individually, but we can certainly discuss them at greater length in the Q&A. And then on the right, I've listed a few of the sources of what I think are really the most relevant kind of specialized sources generating these different protections. And again, I'll give you that concept of binding international law. So the ILO Convention, that's a treaty that can be ratified. The UN Convention on Migrant Workers, a treaty that can be ratified, but it's weaker because very few countries are willing to ratify it. The Inter-American Court issued a very interesting advisory opinion many years ago, and that opinion stated that all undocumented workers have the right to equal protection, indeed additional protections because of their vulnerability. And that was a very important interpretation. And that would apply to most countries in the Americas, unfortunately not directly to the United States, but indirectly so. And then the other documents that I've shown you here are more a soft law. They're recommendation, it's a declaration. It's kind of like the regulations that the UN or the ILO would like to see a country adopt, but cannot mandate. So even with all the wonderful standards that are out there that haven't been ratified, there are some protections that we believe are currently missing, have not been documented in international law. And a few of them are really just politically impossible. One is that if a country like the United States has 7.5 million people working without authorization in its economy, 5% of the workforce is undocumented, probably that means that we need to issue more work visas. We need to make it possible for people to come to the United States in safety and in dignity to take up the jobs that apparently our economy wants them to have. So there's a mismatch with our visa system and the demand for workers and the demand for the jobs. However, international law makes no requirement that countries actually provide as many work visas as the jobs that they are offering. Although that could easily, be made amenable to international human rights law, it's politically very difficult. For people who can come in on a work visa, people who can come in, for example, on the H-2A program in the US to work on a farm, or the H-2B program, there's no right to mobility. So if they come to the US, or and most temporary foreign worker programs around the world work this way, to work for one employer, if they leave that employer and attempt to go to another employer, they lose the right to be here. So that begins to look something like indentured servitude. And it creates a very negative power dynamic, as we see every day in the clinic. Additionally, international law does not require countries to regularize long-standing undocumented populations. So in some countries, there will be generation after generation of people who are undocumented and are not given any kind of status. There's no requirement over time to give protections to people who have really made a permanent commitment to your society. And again, that's a very politicized gap in international law. There's no requirement that people should be allowed to bring their families with them, to bring them in and be together with their families while they're working in another country. Very specifically around farm workers, there's no right of farm labor camp access. And access is a point we talked about. It's very important for people to be able to receive help and connection from the community around them when they're living in the place where they work. And finally, there's no explicit right to have legal remedies to violations of your workers' rights once you've gone back home from abroad, what's often called portability of justice. And so these are some norms that over time can be proposed, can be interpreted into existing international norms as well. So that's another project for the clinic. And at the moment, and I'll just wrap up here. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. We've compiled international norms and we're working on that. And we also are just finishing up the project of developing surveys for different stakeholders in any given country about farm worker law. And we tried as a team to identify who the most important stakeholders were and come up with surveys that we could issue to find out what people believe the law is, how they would characterize it, if it differentially protects farm workers or indeed gives them better protection, and then merge all of that information together to begin to have a sort of a picture of what farm worker law might look like in different countries. To use Pranoto's phrase, you're probably getting a sense, he's more of the theorist of the two of us, an idea of the ethnography of law. So what is the culture of a particular legal system and how does that impact interpretation and treatment of farm workers? So thank you so much for your time, and we really look forward to taking your questions and comments.
Great, we have a number of questions already, but if you want to type in your questions in the Q&A session, you certainly may. And if you like another question that's already been posted and want to boost it to get a higher ranking, just click on the thumbs up there. Let me start with a question that came in from Fethi Kellis. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. He or she asks, what the extent to which your projects are incorporating farm workers themselves? What convergences and divergences do you see in the concerns raised by various farm worker groups that you work with?
So maybe I'll start. Pranoto, should I start?
Yeah, sure.
Well, just in terms of the technicalities of the project, we've had one team, the first team that did field work, that was in 2018, I guess. The 2018 team started off by doing a pilot survey with farm workers, with tea pickers in Indonesia. And Pranoto teamed up with a university and trained students and brought them out to administer the survey, as well as some students and alums from Cornell. And so you saw some of the pictures of the survey taking that was happening. And I think we wound up speaking with 30 people. We really wanted to just get a sense of what the survey would look like and then come back and reformulate it for the next round, which was supposed to occur this summer. And then we had to cancel that. So that's just, so the very first effort that we had actually was to talk with farm workers to get a sense for what their concerns were and to sort of shape our priorities going forward. And Pranoto, I don't know if you want to speak a little more to what you heard in the surveys.
Probably from the first research that we have in Indonesia, I think we learned a lot about, especially the challenge that we face, that we never thought about it before. So, for example, like the research from Cornell, possibly it's very common in a developed country where you need to go to RRB and then you have to follow all the procedure. But the problem with the farm worker, especially when you do research in a country like Indonesia, for example, even in a country, so first, farm worker is very, very invisible group, so nobody really talk about it. And they are like under-educated. So there are multiple issues. So for example, like when you develop a survey instrument, you developed it in English and then you translate it into national language. And then when you go to the appeal, when you met the Indonesian farm worker, they don't really speak the national language. So there are so many, this technical aspect that is really, really difficult, I think, to overcome. And then again, the farm worker, they are so in our case is the tea picker who work for the state-owned tea plantations. So to get to the peel to see them, it's really difficult because you have to go through these efforts, like, you know, to go to the official, and then the official doesn't really want you to go there. So, and then you have to change people because they want to, you know, who come to do the interview is people who they know closely. So you need to find even the very, very local law school, they don't have people who work there, the people who are trusted by the official at the tea plantation. So there are all these kinds of things. It's really difficult. So at this moment, we're trying to develop another path to understand this. So currently, we're trying to understand how the idea of farmworker right can be integrated into the UN declarations. Because this is interesting, the UN declarations on farmworker or the rural populations actually wasn't meant for the farmworker. But then at the end, it integrates farmworker into this declarations. So that's what we are trying to do. And also at the same time, the other interesting point from this question is from this project is that Indonesia also play instrumental role in the drafting or in the development of these UN declarations.
Great. I've got some related questions concerning international farm worker law, which you have already pointed out really does not exist yet. But, you know, how do governments and transnational employers get held accountable either to national or international law when it relates to farm workers? And I have a follow-up question on that. Beth, why don't you start?
Well, the answer is different for every country because every country has made choices about what treaties to ratify and what treaties to avoid. And in that chart that I showed you, most countries have chosen to avoid the treaties that are most important to farm workers, unfortunately. But there are these baseline protections. I think really non-discrimination and equality of treatment is really the most important. And so with that in mind, what you can do is raise farm worker issues in the context of monitoring and enforcement of more baseline treaties that have been more widely ratified. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, or elimination of racial discrimination. And so so what you do there, it's not a very satisfying process for someone like me who's a lawyer who's used to going to court and getting remedies, you know, filing a lawsuit and getting remedies and then enforcing the remedies. Because what you have to do is you wait for the moment every 3 or 5 years or so when the UN is examining the record of a country's comportment under a particular treaty. And you raise, I mentioned this in one of the projects that Wallace Wong, that our alum was doing in Taiwan, you raise what's called a shadow report. You send a report to the UN and say, Taiwan says it's treating Indonesian fishing workers in this way, but we're here to tell you this is what's really happening on the ground. And then the UN will question the government officials, and then the UN will write what's called a concluding observation or a report and urge Taiwan to do better. And then the matter will come up again in 3 to 5 years. So really it's up to civil society to take those reports and get the strongest language they can into them and run with it. It's really, in a way, sort of like legislative advocacy. It's really, you're really lobbying the UN more than you are litigating at the UN. But depending on the country, that can be extremely powerful. You know, sadly, these are kind of colonial relationships. The UN was also built during a colonial era out of colonial power. And so whether or not you agree that international law should impose its will on certain countries, there are countries that do pay attention and are more affected or less affected by what the United Nations says. So it can be a very helpful tool, actually, depending on the country context.
Pranoto, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, maybe. So I think one of the finding, or like a preliminary finding that I have from a series of interview about this struggle, these people or the activists to put forward the agenda of the farm worker, because basically there is no agenda for pushing farm worker into international law, basically. So the only agenda that we have currently, including among the activists, is for the farmer, for the smallholder farmer, not for farm worker. So that's why it's really interesting that questions why farm worker become included in at the final product of the UN declarations, which is come from elite institutions from the ILO and a Western NGO. So it's not from the activists. So this is interesting. So and it's like nobody really, including me before I came to Cornell, I never thought about this part.
The value of a Cornell education.
I guess.
A related question is, we're talking about trying to set up a transnational/international law of farm worker rights, but even if you did, it would have to be implemented at a local or regional level. For example, in New York State, you've got the FLFLPA. So how would regional or state or national laws or norms fit into this discussion of trying to create an international law that protects farm workers? Beth, why don't you start?
Well, the sort of the player, the actor, the unit of enforcement in international law is the nation state. It's built around the nation state. So a nation state makes its commitments, whether it's signing a treaty or refusing to sign a treaty. And so then it's the nation state that is beholden to implement the treaty. So this comes up a lot in the death penalty in the United States, for example, because the Clinton administration might want, something to happen on death row in Virginia or Texas, and the Virginia and Texas governor are not picking up the phone. They're not listening. And so even when you have an administration that actually cares about international commitments and attempts to enforce them internally, because we have a federalist system, this bifurcated system, sometimes we have states or localities that actually cause the entire country to violate international law. So that's just a peculiarity of countries that have multiple levels of jurisdictions that have the amount of power that states do in our particular system. And then if you have a situation like you mentioned here, Eleanor, where we have a better protection in one state than we do in other states, of course, when the US goes to the UN, that's what they're going to tout. They're going to talk about the success stories. And then it's our job to say, yes, well, why is it only in a handful of states that people actually have the right to unionize or have overtime, as opposed to, look at the South where people can't even get the, 911 to come out and rescue them from drowning. So those unevenness really does kind of even out at the international level, and countries are looked at as a whole.
Pranoto?
So I also thought about this, and so that's why we come up with the idea about the rise of international farm worker law. So so I thought with this momentum, with the adoptions of the UN declarations, I think it should be like the moment where we can probably collate and identify. So that's why I at some point I thought that Beth maybe should develop some kind of a database law that touch all aspect of the farm worker, because this is like the first place where for example, like the women's right. So it's almost similar with the women's right. Before you have a strong recognitions that farm workers should be treated as a distinct subject. So I think probably
Great. Another question that's come in is, Beth, you talked about Norway. And the person asks, given the conservatism that's emerged in several places, I wonder if Norway came to pass, I wonder how Norway came to pass the enhanced worker protections that the United States still has not managed to codify. Do you see particular areas as ripe for advocacy to encourage more robust protections, maybe using Norway as a case study?
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason why I decided to look there, because I know, I mean, in general, the US tends to look toward Western Europe. And I knew that things were getting worse in a lot of countries, but I thought maybe in Norway we would have better luck. So I just couldn't believe it to learn that it wasn't until about 2003 that they actually created the same level of protection, that these same, you know, really odious exclusions that we still have in the US existed there as well. Um, and actually, the only reason why Norway made the change and leveled the playing field, and still it isn't being enforced. I mean, I think a lot of farms in Norway look just like what we see here. But at least, you know, de jure, like on the face of the law, why it changes because the EEC forced their hand. This was a non-discrimination move by the European Economic Community, of which Norway is a part. So it really was pressure from international law, from a regional body, that made it happen there, because politically it was too difficult to solve the problem.
Pranoto, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, but actually, I think I'm more interested in seeing more from the U.S. because I think U.S. is more developed in terms of cash flow in Farmworker. So if U.S. can spearhead it in developing a systematic how the case flow in Farmworker manifests, I think that would be a good start. I think.
Great. Another question is, I understand governments wanting to prevent permanent settlement of migrant farm workers, and that fact contributes to the lack of protections and limited visa counts. How does the lack of support for migrant farm workers encourage or discourage resettlement?
Well, Steve, you might really be better qualified to answer this. I mean, I think it's kind of an interesting issue, because most people, I think, on the planet would like to stay right where they were born and have a safe and healthy life. You know, I think that's really kind of the human condition, and people are forced out of their homes for a myriad of reasons. And so oftentimes what I see in the people that I work with and collaborate with is that they would like to earn enough money to take care of their families and eventually go home and have a better life at home. But oftentimes people are stopped from doing that because it's not really safe to return and come back. You know, the possibility of kind of rotating migration is not available because it's so unsafe and so expensive to make the travel. So in a way, the illegality actually makes it more difficult for people to return home in a seasonal way. So I think, and then some people come and they form a life and they want to resettle. But Steve, I don't know if you want to help out with that one.
I would say basically the same thing, that we have hardened our borders, and because of that, it's much less likely that someone who does make it into the United States is going to have circular migration. They're basically stuck here, and that's a problem. And the limited visa counts also is a problem. If there were more visas, so we didn't have people coming in illegally, people might be more likely to go back. So it's a complex problem with no easy solution.
Yeah.
Pranoto, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Pranoto, what do you see with people who leave Indonesia to go and work, for example, in the Gulf states or in Taiwan? What do you think their motivations are if they were given the option?
Certainly, because I think it's the push and pull factor maybe, because also at the same time in Indonesia it's very difficult and it's overpopulations. So that's the part of the Indonesia, and also the recruiter is very like really eager to get them out of there. So sometimes even if you don't have money, you can go there. You can go to work outside abroad. But even though, so it's more like it's really difficult. So for example, like the law school that we partner in Indonesia, basically that law school is sustained by the remittance. So that's, I think.
Yeah, by remittances.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's,
Another question is, I'm wondering about the relationship between agricultural work and work in other industries, such as resource extraction, which also has significant migrant labor. This speaks to a broader question of exploitation of non-citizen status generally. What policies regarding non-citizen labor rights might be more effective than industry-specific reforms just for international farm workers, for example?
right. Yeah, I mean, it's really impossible to disentangle migrant worker rights from farm worker rights because it's such a high percentage of farm workers. But, you know, as I showed in the slides, migrant worker rights generically are not getting, you know, having any more traction than rights aimed at farm workers. They're really kind of lumped together in terms of their political toxicity. But we do have a colleague, Ian Kissel, who's working on a way that's more focused on migrant rights. And what he's having to do is generate norms that are good norms, but have to start off as soft norms. They have to start off as declarations. And it's just a very slow process to get the international community, as long as the global north has as much control as it does in international law. It's just very difficult to get migrant protections passed. Maybe one thing to mention about kind of a success story in migrant rights, and that's refugee protection. I mean, the area that Steve's clinic works in is working with a US standard, the refugee definition and protections for asylum seekers that was first written in an international treaty after the Second World War, the Refugee Convention and Protocol. And the US ratified the protocol and eventually, you know, a couple decades later, took that definition and actually incorporated it directly into our statutory scheme. So when Steve is litigating a refugee case or an asylum case, he's using the same definition pretty much that's being applied all around the world, which has its own utility. You know, there is a little bit of conversation back and forth when domestic violence as a grounds for asylum happened in Canada or Australia, we were able to point to that. So I would say that, you know, refugee protection is probably the only relatively successful example of international law protecting immigrants. And even that, as we know, is very contested. We saw what happened after the Syrian refugee situation and how that really shifted politics to the right in Europe.
Pranoto, you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay. Another question on a slightly different topic. We're curious about international farm worker law in relation to fair trade certification for products sold in the Western world and how that is enforced. Does that protect corporations by having a third-party certifier? And if so, is the third-party certifier liable? Also, how are biofuel companies held accountable for the slave labor in Malaysia? Not exactly related to international farm workers, so if you don't want to answer that or can't, that's fine.
Pranoto might want to talk about, I don't know if you'd like to address it. I mean, generally, I think there's a very similar problem, especially in the global north, which is that it's really the retail food chains that are keeping prices low. And that's forcing down the only factor of cost that's really directly in the farmer's control, which is labor. And so part of this is really just to, I mean, the person who gave the question is sort of pointing out, it's really a problem of us. It's a problem of consumers, and it's a problem of retail cost of goods. So here in the US, there are a couple of brave experiments, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the Fair Food Program, and the Milk with Dignity program in Vermont that are trying to tie the retail end directly to protections and additional wages for workers by having a contract system with suppliers. So honestly, in Asia, I haven't seen that kind of model. I know that Justin Lin has been looking into it more. He's the alum who's about to join our team, so maybe he can put an answer into the Q&A. But yeah, I think another sort of route that we have seen in Asia, this is around fishing workers in Thailand, and that was pressure from the EU. The EU threatened to withhold trade relations around fisheries with Thailand until certain protections were put in place. And Human Rights Watch was just relentless, kept putting out reports about slavery and trafficking and fishing in Thailand. And it wound up, moving the EU to sort of flex its muscle, again, a colonial muscle. And we did see some change come out of that. So it's not really as neat as having a nice kind of food chain solution, but that's, supply chain solution, but that's ultimately, I think, where we will head. Certainly in the US, these efforts of the Fair Food Council are actually having some success. But ultimately, it will have to be what I saw when I went to Norway to do research, which is we all have to pay a lot more for our groceries. And until we're willing to do that, farmers are going to be stuck in the middle and farm workers are going to be in misery, essentially immiserated.
Great. Pranoto, you want to add anything?
No, thank you.
Okay. We've talked a lot about sort of a top-down approach, international law forcing governments to treat farm workers better. What about a bottom-up approach? What can farm workers do to muster protections themselves by tapping into various sources or generating social capital or creating networks to have their concerns addressed and resolved?
Well,
So
here, oh, go ahead, Pranoto. No, you start.
So for me is I think it's important to have a labor union to accept them and welcome them. I think that's just the most important thing. But the problem is, so far as I see it, I think labor union doesn't really like a farm worker. So even in country like Indonesia, they don't really interested in having farm worker is mostly are disorganized. So I think that's one of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to do outreach to farm workers. And like Pranoto was saying, there's a language difference. Whether in Indonesia, it's because they speak Sundanese, or in the US, it's because they speak an indigenous language or Spanish. So it really does make it more difficult, in addition to these exclusions that we were talking about. But I really think, the example that Eleanor gave of the recent legislation here in New York State is a great example of how upstate New York just has some organizations with paralegals and community organizers who've just been very effective outside the union, the formal union system. At first, just connecting with people, offering them services that are useful, building trust. And I do think that it helps to have a program like the Cornell Farmworker program, like Mary Jo Dudley's, to have institutions like universities providing support to people and building trust so that they're able to connect with organizers and lawyers. Really, I think that the new legislation here in New York State is an example of a victory that came about because of successful organizing.
It took a long time, but eventually it was successful, and now we need to implement it fairly, and that's another battle. And Beth, along those same lines, we had a farm worker union, we do have a farm worker union, Chavez in California, but that's had its own problems in terms of trying to organize farm workers from the bottom up. Do you have any insights from that experience that you want to share with the group?
Yeah, I think it's just very difficult to overcome the all the different power differentials, and then you add in that people are living in the place where they work. You add in language difference, you add in rurality, and then you add in immigration status. I was a farm worker lawyer for 15 years in Pennsylvania, where we didn't have state legislation. There was a gap both in the federal law and the state law, so no protection for unionizing. We had a very tiny mushroom workers union because we managed, or the local civil society managed, to argue that mushroom workers are not farm workers because it's a year-round enterprise. But it was a tiny union, and eventually, it lost its hold in the workplace where it was. And so what we would actually see there was that if a union effort began to get some momentum, it was very easy to call ICE, or back then INS, and the entire union could just be deported in one raid in one day. So you have the compounding problem of immigration status, which is baked into our own immigration law, And that really undermines anything else that you can achieve.
An unrelated question. Have the movements toward community-supported agriculture and organic farming helped farm workers, either in the US or internationally? Maybe I'll start with you, Pranoto.
I think in Indonesia, I think there's no such a movement. And also, I think in some other country, also like Malaysia, in fact, the increasing animosity against farmworker as a migrant is increasing because the politic, enable it. So maybe not. But I think in Taiwan, because I recently been interviewed by a group of students who were encouraged by their Ministry of Foreign Affairs to interview me about farmworker who comes from Indonesia, but I'm not really sure. I think it's more like a politically motivated because Taiwan is being bullied by China government, so I'm not really sure.
Well, I know there's a movement in fishing, for sustainable fish, and there's Conservation International and foundations like Hewlett Packard that is trying to make sure that all fish is sustainable. I wondered if that's extending to helping the people who are in that industry as well. Not as far as you're aware.
I'd say that's the case in Europe. It's interesting, in Europe, you'll often see sustainability posed as green and labor maybe as a bit of an afterthought. So yeah, I think that and animal rights too, which is a kind of a separate inquiry that also is a reform movement focused on agriculture. And so, those can be strange bedfellows sometimes, but yeah, I think sometimes it can be helpful, and then sometimes it's really irrelevant, and and the two movements wind up working at cross purposes.
Great. Well, we've run out of time, so I want to take the last few minutes to thank both Beth and Pranoto for a very interesting discussion. A lot to work on, and I'm glad that Cornell is taking a lead in trying to help international farm workers in a variety of ways. That's it for today's seminar. Next week, we'll have an interesting panel discussion about public benefits and immigration, and some interesting research that Cornell Medical School and the Cornell Law School are doing. If you have not already registered for that particular webinar, you can go to migrations.cornell.edu/study and register for that, as well as the other public lectures in this series, which are typically on Wednesdays at 3 o'clock. Well, that will close for tonight, but thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.